Hello everyone and welcome to the first drawing tutorial. Daffodils are the star of the show here, so take a pen and any notebook and let's start making the first flower. I started with a basic cone shape, drawing a simple ellipse while looking at the photo reference and then adding depth with that bottom part that resembles a cone, but it's slightly slimmer. It doesn't have to be perfect, here we're just figuring out the placement of things. And after the cone part, we need to figure out the petal placement. My tip here is to first make an elliptical shape that's similar in size where the petals are in your photo reference, and that's angled almost as the smaller ellipse that we already have in that cone shaped part. Here I tried to draw it without it and something seemed off, so I added that ellipse later on, as you can see here. And this is where you have to imagine how the flower looks behind the center part. By looking at the photo, I see that the top part is hidden behind and it's slightly lower. So with a one petal exception that I'll add later on, but the rest of the petals are on the lower part. From this point, I'm using a photo reference to see how each petal is angled and I'm replacing it as close as I can. If you're using your phone to see the photo, really zoom it in, and if you want, you can pretend to draw it on your phone to gain that muscle memory of that shape in your hand and then add it to your paper. Sometimes that helps. Feel free to draw as many lines as you want to modify the shape. It's supposed to be messy at this stage and you're carving out a plant drawing on one piece of paper, and every mistake is here to help you learn. When I'm happy with the petal layout, I'll move back to add some depth to our center part of this daffodil. By adding one parallel line to our inner bottom part of that oval shape, we're adding depth, and it's that easy. From that point, you can see where the shadow is and add some outlines for it. When we're done with the first flower, let's move on to the second one. I wanted to show you 3 different placements in this drawing, and the second one is kind of away and it's looking up at an angle. As in the first one, we're starting with a basic cone shape for the center part, and here I'm making the ellipse a bit wider and the bottom part slightly slimmer, like a trumpet. From that point, we need to figure out petal placement, and since this flower looks way up, they're going to stay lower. So we need to draw a wider ellipse that's almost touching the smaller one at the same angle as the smaller one. So looking at this photo, the shape is really slim and it's slimmer than our first version, so I'll keep it like that. When that's finished, I like to zoom in and see the petals and their shape clearly, and I'm trying to replicate that as close as possible. Pay attention on the overlap and distance between the trumpet part that we have and the petal. Some of them are higher and closer to the smaller ellipse, and some of them have more distance. So add as many lines as you need until you get the shape that you want for each of them. I also like to add a few lines for the trumpet part just to see the movement, but that's optional. When you're happy with the shape, let's move on to the third flower. I intentionally wanted to add one that's facing downwards, so here I'm using a different photo reference, and all of them will be linked in the description if you want to use them too. First, as always, we're making that trumpet cone shape, but this time it's facing down at an angle, but this time it's kind of different. So when we do that, we're adding a bigger ellipse with that same angle, and as in this photo, it's almost hugging and enveloping the whole trumpet part. So from that point, petals need to be placed facing downwards. Pay close attention to the photo reference that you're using and how they're shaped. How far or close are they next to the center part of the daffodil? How much of them is shown? And don't be afraid if the shape is weird. Always try to use some basic shapes for start and then build around them. When we're done with that, the next step will be to add stalks. And here I don't use a photo reference to guide me, I just add them where I think it's natural, so you can do that too if you're doing the same piece as me. So imagine where it connects to the flower and build it from there. Now, when we made basic placement, it's time to carve out the real shape of the flower. I'm going a bit harder with my pencil and I'm adding details on the trumpet shape first, outlining the base first and then adding waves to the outer edges since they're a bit ruffled in real life. This part is really about drawing and fixing if you see that something doesn't fit quite right. This last flower really was a pain to draw for me, so staying focused and using that photo reference is the key here. And that center part can be intimidating at first, but be persistent and draw until you get the shapes right. And that's how I do it all the time, plus we have an eraser to save us. And then the petals are a bit simpler at this point. The key is not to try to be perfect and really make them wavy and flowy, if that makes any sense. Rely on your photo reference to see how they overlap and where they bend. The bottom flower has them angled and facing downwards with two smaller petals that are on the top part. One is barely looking like a petal, and that's okay. The others look pretty much standard, and two of them are placed behind the center part. When we're done with that, let's add some quick definition to the stalk of this flower, and let's move on to the next reference. When you're happy with the final look of the flower, we need to polish others too. So I had to slightly erase my initial sketch, but you don't have to if your hand is light. And let's move on. Next, I'm going to tackle the center part of the first flower that we made. First, I want to clearly define the depth of this trumpet shape by outlining the edges to replicate their wavy nature. And then I'm defining that parallel inner bottom line even further, and I'm adding some lines to the top part that define how the shape bends and goes into the bottom part, where I added some sharper lines to represent the eye of the plant or the smaller details, with adding some more shading to the very bottom inner part just to add some more depth. Next step is to define the cup base and then define the petals even further. Now I'm really zooming in the photo reference and looking at every single detail that I need to replicate. Sometimes if the shape is tougher to draw, I like to pretend that I draw on the photo reference on my phone or somewhere else, just to get a feel of how my hand should go, and then I do that same motion on paper. Maybe that's cheating, but it helps you learn. And don't be hard on yourself if you can't find a way to draw something correctly. Use a different paper angle, drawing angle, erase it and try again. It'll be better eventually and you'll improve with practice. When you're happy with outlining the flower, you can start adding some small shading guidelines with your pencil, so it'll be easier for you to ink it in the stage that's coming. Here we just need to draw a few lines on each petal and the center part, wherever we find a darker shade of color in our reference photo, and maybe you can add a few extra parts too if you want to darken it a bit further. As in our previous steps, we'll start polishing the center part, making ruffled edges and slimming the shape as it goes closer to the base of the stalk. And later, using a closer look at our reference to figure out petal placement and shapes of every single one. The ones on the right side are a bit complicated in this reference. The one closer to the middle has a basic trapeze-like shape with an edge that's wavy and overlapping at the top, and the one that peaks on the side looks like a boomerang, so try to make them like that while having that in mind. While other two on the left side have a basic petal shape with a slight point on the edge. And lastly, we're going to outline and polish our flower that's facing downwards, beginning with that ruffled part on the center part a bit more, since in my version it wasn't defined like I wanted to. and adding some shading details where we see darker parts in our reference photo. If it helps, you can download the photo and use any program to turn it black and white. Sometimes that's easier, so you can see that in my inking stage. It helps a lot. But for now, we're just making our plan for shading the petals in inking stage, so you don't need to make this part super neat. And for the end of this part, we'll add a few leaves that are loosely based on our photo reference and add stalks where we missed them, if we did. And when that's finished, we'll start the fun part, and that's inking. Here I'm using a 0.3 fine liner, starting with the outer edges of the flower parts and outlining the center part first, and then we move onto the petals. Use your pencil drawing as a guideline here, but you don't have to follow it exactly if you think something looks weird and it could look better. If you see that outer edges of the center part could use some more detail, why not add them? But be careful not to overdo it, since with inking there's no going back once you mess it up. I learned that the hard way. So when you carefully outline the center, petals are logically our next step. Here I'm using a different angle to show you inking process a bit better. With petals, use lines that are not fully straight. Let them flow naturally and let them crinkle and bend. That's my number one tip here. Use that method for every flower. They'll feel more natural when they're imperfect in that way. If you need, you can do this part as slow as you need to. It's really therapeutic to get lost in inking and learn how some objects behave in that way. Once you're finished with inking, you can start erasing your initial sketch or leave it. I prefer to leave some parts that I made for shading. It will help me later. And this part is totally up to you and your personal preference. So now I'm using 0.1 fine liner for this stage, and on the upper right side you can see that photo reference in black and white. This one is a bit lighter. So when I do my inking, I like to darken up some parts a bit more, but again, that's personal preference and you should follow your intuition here. When you see or think it's enough, it probably is. By looking at this black and white photo, we see where the darker parts are at the base of the center part, inside the middle flower, and outside the trumpet shape on the other two. And here you can clearly see how petals have lines where they're shaded a bit and how they symmetrically align towards the edges of the petal. We're going to shade in the base and the middle part of the trumpet shape of the middle flower with some additional lines that shape it more and add some dimension to the inner part. And then we'll add some shading to the petals where they overlap, just to add more dimension to them, and then we'll tackle the middle of the petal and aligning the lines according to the shape of the petal. When it's closer to the edge, we'll shape it in similar fashion and follow the shape and angle on the photo reference to keep the flow natural. When you're closer to the base, you can add more lines there just to add more depth. When some elements are behind, feel free to add more lines and create darker shading. I always like to add more shading parts that are closer to the base and pay attention to the petals and their edges too. Also, darkening and shading from the tip of the petal can also add wonderful details, so add a few of them and see how you like it, if it needs more shading or not. That's also personal preference. And always use your reference if you're uncertain. Now, when you do the first layer of inking, you decide how you want to continue this. This now comes to our personal preference. How you like to draw, if you have a style or aesthetical preference. Are you pleased with the result you have, or you think there's some room for improvement? Where you see places that miss something special? If you do, let's focus on that. If you're already pleased with the result, you can wrap it up and consider it finished. and that's your current preference and you made it, so be proud of it. And if you want to add more details like I do here, keep on going and focus on those parts that you want to improve. Add more shading, more lines, and whatever you feel that's missing in here. I'm emphasizing the ruffles on the other trumpet edges and adding lines to the petals a bit more, mostly in the middle, and tiny lines on the very edges that appear darker on the photo, and emphasizing the base a bit more with shading and darkening up some elements that are in the background almost, really focusing to define the petals and the center part of the daffodil, shading overlapping elements and places where they overlap. At this stage, you really need to use your intuition and look at the details that you want to bring into the light and parts that you want to keep darker. And when you're happy with the result, you need to shade in the stalks and the leaves. At this point, I really got tired, but I used the same principles as I did for the flowers, darkening parts that are behind, that overlap, and adding shading where I think it's needed. When you're finished, you can go even further and color it traditionally, or you can do it digitally. And voila, you have a finished daffodil drawing. I hope this video was helpful, and if you think so, hit that like button and subscribe and that little bell so you can get notified when I upload. And comment down, let me know what tutorial you want to see next. I hope you found it useful, and thank you for watching. Ciao! P.S. My neighbors are insanely loud, so if you hear some weird noises, that's because this time is crazy and I really want to make this tutorial. So if you hear some kids screaming behind or moving furniture, that's it.